I remember the exact moment I decided to do it. I was standing in my walk-in closet at my house in Westchester, surrounded by tailored blazers and designer heels I'd collected over 30 years of climbing the corporate ladder. My phone had just buzzed with yet another text from my son Marcus, asking if I was ready for Friday night dinner. Casual, his fiancée Chloe had insisted. Nothing fancy, just our family getting to know each other before the wedding. Something in my gut twisted. I'd met Chloe's mother, Victoria, exactly once before that. One lunch where she'd spent the entire time mentioning the square footage of their Hamptons estate and their daughter's Ivy League pedigree. She'd barely asked me a single question about myself, but when Marcus mentioned that Victoria had made some comment about me probably working retail or something cute, something inside me snapped awake. I wasn't going to go to that dinner as Margaret Chen, Regional Vice President of Operations for a Fortune 500 company. I was going to show up as the version of myself that Victoria had already decided I was. Because I needed to see if my son had married into a family that valued a person for who they actually were, or just for what they appeared to be worth. So I stood there in my closet and pulled out the pieces I never wore. A pair of jeans I'd owned since 2015, faded and with a small hole near the hem. A sweater from a discount store, the kind with a loose thread at the cuff. I found my oldest pair of sneakers, the kind with the soles starting to separate slightly from the canvas. I didn't style my hair. I let it fall flat. No makeup except a bit of lip balm. I looked tired. I looked working class. I looked invisible. When I caught my reflection in the mirror, I barely recognized myself, and that was exactly the point. The drive to their home in Greenwich took 40 minutes from mine. Their estate sat behind a black iron gate, the driveway lined with manicured hedges that probably cost more to maintain annually than most people's car payments. The house was a study in understated wealth, not ostentatious, but so carefully, so deliberately perfect that it screamed money from every architectural angle. I pulled my 10-year-old Subaru into the circular drive next to Marcus's car. I saw the moment he spotted me through the window, that flash of confusion on his face. He came rushing out before I even turned off the engine. "Mom?" He pulled open my car door, taking in my appearance with genuine bewilderment. "Are you okay? Did something happen?" "I'm fine, sweetheart." I kissed his cheek. "Just wanted to be comfortable." He didn't press it. Marcus had always been gentle, less inclined to interrogate his mother's choices. That was part of why I loved him, and also part of why I needed to know if he'd chosen a partner and a family that would treat him, and by extension me, with basic human decency. Victoria answered the door before Marcus could knock. She was tall, blonde, with the kind of sculpted appearance that suggested a rigorous relationship with both a trainer and a plastic surgeon. Her eyes moved across me like a scanner, from my sneakers to my hair, and I watched her land on a conclusion, fast and not a good one. "Margaret," she said, and I could hear it in the single word. Pity, worry, the kind of tone people use when they're concerned their son might have made a terrible mistake. "We're so glad you could make it." "Thank you for having me," I said warmly. She didn't invite me to hug her. The dining room was all marble and fresh flowers, a table set with what had to be Waterford crystal and probably Limoges china. Victoria's husband Derek was there, with his polo shirt and his air of vague importance. He barely looked up when I shook his hand. Chloe was lovely, actually. She seemed genuinely happy to see me, though I caught her noticing her mother's body language and physically shrinking slightly as a result. And then there was Chloe's brother, Preston, who took one look at me and repositioned himself farther down the table. They'd seated me at the far end, near the kitchen. Not deliberately, I'm sure they told themselves. Just where the flow of the meal worked better. Just logistics. Victoria started with a story about their recent trip to Monaco, the kind of casual mention designed to establish hierarchy. Derek chimed in about his little golf situation, a membership at some exclusive club I'd never heard of, which was probably the point. Preston talked about his portfolio, the word dripping with significance. The conversation moved around the table like a dance, each person placing their offering of accomplishment and wealth on display. I sat and I listened. I passed the butter when asked. I complimented the food. I remained small. "So, Margaret," Victoria said, finally turning her attention toward me, knife and fork resting delicately on the edge of her plate. "What is it that you do? For work, I mean." This was the moment. This was where the test really began. I looked down at my plate, took a small bite, then looked back up at her with what I hoped read as pleasant but unremarkable. "Oh, I work in corporate," I said vaguely. "Operations. Nothing too exciting." "Operations?" She turned the word over in her mouth as if it were slightly unpleasant. "Like what? Management? Administrative?" "Something like that," I said, buttering a piece of bread. "The details get pretty boring." She nodded, and I saw the exact moment she'd catalogued me and filed me away. Not a threat, not particularly interesting, probably making somewhere in the mid-5 figures. The kind of mother to a son who was clearly elevated in status by marrying into the Ashford family. Derek jumped in with a story about a business deal that had fallen through for him, framed in a way that somehow made him seem bigger for it. The conversation moved on. I'd been weighed and measured and found to be exactly what they'd expected, or rather, exactly what they'd needed me to be. Throughout the meal, I watched them. I watched the way Victoria spoke to the servers, polite, but with an edge of command. I watched the way Derek interrupted his wife without apology. I watched the way Preston used references to restaurants and brands I'd never heard of, not to invite conversation, but to establish distance. And I watched Chloe, who kept shooting me these apologetic looks, as if she could sense something was wrong, but couldn't quite identify what. My son, though, my son kept trying. He asked me about work. He talked about the wedding plans. He made sure my wine glass was never empty. He was doing what he could to integrate me into his new family, not realizing that his new family had already decided where I belonged in their hierarchy, and it was at the far end of the table, my best answer deemed too boring to elaborate on. When Victoria brought out dessert, a pavlova that was probably imported from somewhere, I could feel the evening reaching its conclusion. I was already thinking about how I would drive home, how I would sit at my own kitchen table and feel the weight of what I'd learned. Not just about them, but about what my son's life was about to become. And then Victoria excused herself from the table. Derek had stepped into a work call. Preston had gone to the kitchen for coffee. And it was just me, Chloe, and the moment that would change everything that came after. Chloe was clearing plates when her mother returned. There was something different about Victoria's posture, a kind of determined straightness, the way someone carries themselves when they've made a decision they believe is for the greater good. She settled back into her seat and looked directly at me. "Can I ask you something, Margaret?" She didn't wait for permission. Are you having financial difficulties right now?" The directness of it actually caught me off guard, even though I was expecting something. "I'm sorry?" "It's just, I want to help," Victoria continued, and there was something almost rehearsed about the way she said it, like she'd been practicing this conversation in the car before dinner. "Marcus is very important to our family now, to all of us, and I would hate to see him burdened." I set down my fork slowly, deliberately. I let the silence stretch for a moment before I asked, "Burdened by what exactly?" Victoria glanced toward the kitchen, where Preston was doing something unnecessarily loud with the espresso machine. By financial responsibility for family members who might be struggling. It's not uncommon, and there's absolutely no shame in it. I just want to know what we're working with here. Chloe had frozen mid-plate, a piece of silverware held suspended between the table and the tray. She was staring at her mother like she'd just watched a stranger emerge from her mother's skin. "Go on," I said quietly. "I have a proposal," Victoria said, and now there was something almost warm in her voice, the warmth of someone who believes they're being generous. "A monthly stipend, if you need help. It would come from Derek and me. You would take it, and you would step back. Let Marcus build his life with Chloe without the weight of—" She paused, searching for the word. "Without the weight of a parent who isn't doing well financially, who might eventually need him to support her." I watched her face as she said it. I watched the genuine belief there, the certainty that she was doing something kind. "How much?" I asked. $750 a month, she said, paid directly to you. And we ask that you phase yourself out of the picture. Gradually, of course. We don't want to hurt anyone. But Marcus needs to be free to build his future without guilt, without the expectation that he should be taking care of you." The room went silent. Truly silent. The kind of silence that holds weight, that presses against your eardrums. Chloe had set down her plate and tray. She was shaking her head, a small movement, back and forth. "Victoria," I said slowly, "how much do you think a regional vice president of operations makes?" I watched her face go blank. "I'm sorry?" $750 a month, I continued, speaking quietly but with perfect clarity. "That's roughly $9,000 a year. I made that amount in my first 2 weeks back in January. I'm 32 years into a career in corporate operations management. I oversee a department of 43 people across 4 states. My last bonus was larger than the annual salary of some teachers." Victoria's mouth had gone slack. Derek had stopped typing on his phone. Preston had actually emerged from the kitchen doorway, hovering there like he'd been called by some invisible force. "But you're wearing—" Victoria started, and I held up a hand. "I'm wearing clothes from the discount section of Target," I said, "because I wanted to see if you would judge me based on who I am, or based on what you could see. I wanted to know if my son had chosen a family that valued substance over surface. I wanted to see if any of you would bother to know me before you'd already decided who I was." Chloe had covered her mouth with her hand. There were tears in her eyes. "I have a 4-bedroom home in Westchester that I own outright," I continued. "I have a retirement account that will be more than sufficient. I do not need $9,000 a year. What I needed was to see if a family that claimed to care about Marcus would extend the most basic courtesy of actually knowing his mother before deciding she was a liability." Victoria's face had gone white. Not just pale, the kind of white that comes when blood drains fast from a person's head, when their body is responding to genuine shock. "Margaret, Derek started, but I wasn't finished. "Do you know what my proudest accomplishment is?" I asked, and I was looking at Marcus now, though my words were for all of them. "It's not the title or the salary or the house. It's raising a son who is kind, who shows up, who tries to be good even when the people around him might not be, who asked his mother if she was okay when he saw me pull up in a 10-year-old car. Not because of what the car said about my finances, but because he genuinely cares about my well-being." Chloe had started crying openly now. Silent tears just running down her face. "Marcus," Victoria said, and her voice had changed. It had taken on this edge of panic, of suddenly realizing that she might have damaged something she couldn't simply buy her way back into fixing. We had no idea. We would never have. No, I said, and I stood up from the table. You would never have, but you did. Because you made assumptions. Because you looked at someone in old clothes and decided you knew exactly who they were and what they were worth. And you decided that was worth insulting, worth testing, worth trying to buy off like an inconvenient problem. I looked at my son. I'm proud of you, I told him. I want you to know that. Regardless of how tonight ends, regardless of what your wife's family does or doesn't do, I want you to know that I am so proud of the person you've become. And I hope you'll extend to people the kind of grace and decency that I can see you tried so hard to extend to me, even when you didn't understand what was happening. Then I looked back at Victoria. And you, I said. You offered me $750 a month. You know what the most insulting part of that was? It wasn't the amount. It was that you genuinely believed that money was the only language I would understand. That it was the only thing that could possibly move me. You were willing to pay me to disappear, not because you were worried about burdening Marcus, but because you were worried that my presence, my existence, would somehow reveal that your worldview was based on something other than substance. Derek had gone very red. Preston had disappeared back into the kitchen. Victoria looked like she might physically be ill. This is who I am, I said, and I gestured down at my clothes. This, the jeans with the hole, the sweater from Target, the old sneakers. This is what it looks like when a woman is comfortable enough in herself not to need to perform for other people. And I'm sorry if that was confusing for you. I gathered my purse. Thank you for dinner. It was illuminating. Chloe stood up. Mrs. Chen, Margaret, I'm so sorry. I had no idea what my mother was planning. I swear I didn't know. Please, please don't blame Marcus for this. I softened. She wasn't the one who needed to bear the weight of her mother's assumptions. I know, sweetheart, I said, and I meant it. None of this is your fault, or his. I looked at Marcus. Walk me to the door? He followed me out, and in the foyer of that perfect house, my son wrapped his arms around me. I'm sorry, he whispered into my hair. I'm so sorry. I didn't know she was going to do that. I know, baby, I said, and it's okay. It needed to happen. Both of us needed to see some things tonight. I drove home through the darkness, my hands on the steering wheel, feeling something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I was holding. It wasn't victory exactly. It was something quieter than that. It was the peace of knowing that I'd stood by my principles, hadn't performed for acceptance, and hadn't tried to be smaller than I actually am. I'd shown up as myself, and I'd let people choose whether or not that was enough for them. The wedding was 6 weeks away. In those 6 weeks, I heard from Chloe twice. The first time was 2 days after the dinner. She called and apologized profusely. She told me that she'd had no idea what her mother was planning, that she was mortified, that she loved my son and wanted me to know that she wasn't the person her mother was. I believed her. She sounded young and frightened and genuinely troubled by what had happened. I told her that I harbored no ill will toward her, and I meant it. The second time was 4 weeks later. She texted to ask if I would walk with her down the aisle instead of her father. Derek had apparently been a distant, unavailable father. She wanted someone there who had shown her, by example, what real integrity looked like. I said yes. I didn't tell Marcus. I wanted him to be surprised. Victoria called me once. It was the most uncomfortable phone call I've ever participated in. She started with an apology that sounded like it had been written down and rehearsed multiple times. She said she'd made assumptions. She said she was sorry. She said she hoped I could forgive her. I listened to all of it, and when she finished, I asked her the question that I genuinely wanted answered. Why did you think that would work, Victoria? Even if I had been struggling financially, why did you think that offering me money to disappear was something I would accept? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Because, she said finally, in my experience, money is the solution to most problems. I considered that, and I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but something closer to pity. She had spent her entire life believing that money was the answer to everything, that it could fix problems and relationships. She had raised a daughter and a son in that environment, and now she was terrified that maybe she'd gotten it wrong. It's not, I said quietly. It never is. The wedding was at a country club, predictably. It was the kind of wedding that appears in magazines, perfectly orchestrated, meticulously planned, the kind of event that serves as a monument to the taste and resources of the people who organized it. I wore a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, a beautiful blue silk number that cost more than some people's monthly rent. I did my hair and makeup. I showed up as Margaret Chen in her entirety, not some diminished version created for someone else's comfort. The moment I took Chloe's arm at the top of the aisle, I felt her relax. She squeezed my elbow and whispered, "Thank you for this." I watched my son's face as his bride came toward him. The love there was real. It was uncomplicated and generous, and the kind of love that didn't require her to be anything other than herself. That was what I'd been testing for in the end. Not whether his new family would be impressed by me, but whether his marriage would be grounded in real love or just in the performance of suitable partnerships. As I took my seat in the front row, Derek leaned over. He didn't say much, just, "I understand now, what you were doing. I respect that." I nodded. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. At the reception, Victoria approached me during cocktail hour. She was visibly nervous. "Margaret," she said, and then she paused, seeming to gather herself. "I've been in therapy since that dinner, trying to understand where that came from, why I would do something like that. My therapist says I have a lot of anxiety about my children's choices, and I try to control things as a way of managing that anxiety. I don't know if that explains it or excuses it, but I wanted you to know that I'm working on it." I studied her face. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been forced to confront parts of herself she didn't particularly like. "I appreciate you telling me that," I said. "I hope the work is helpful for you, for all of you." "Would you be willing to have dinner again?" she asked. "A real one, where I actually try to get to know you as a person, not just as an obstacle to manage." It was a leap, a genuine one. I could see her holding her breath, waiting for me to decide whether this was worth another chance. "I'd like that," I said. "But this time, let's just be ourselves. No performance, no agenda, just people trying to know each other." She nodded, and I watched her shoulders drop slightly, like she'd been released from something. The rest of the evening unfolded the way good weddings do. There was dancing and toasts, and the particular kind of joy that comes from witnessing two people commit to something larger than themselves. I danced with Marcus and watched him with Chloe, and I felt the relief of knowing that despite everything, he was choosing love. That he'd learned that from me, or I hoped he had. Preston cornered me at one point near the bar. He was drinking an expensive scotch and looking at me with something that might have been curiosity. "I researched you," he said without preamble. "After that dinner, I looked up your company and your title and everything. My mother was essentially offering you $9,000 to disappear, when you probably spend that on your mortgage every month." "Not quite," I said. "My house is paid off, but the math tracks." He laughed, but it sounded uncomfortable. "What was the point?" of coming to dinner like that? To see if I would be treated with basic human decency, regardless of how I looked, I said. To see what kind of people my son had married into. To see if my presence mattered, or if I was just something to be managed away. And, he asked. Mixed results, I said. Your family is very focused on status and wealth, but at least one of you is capable of growth and self-reflection. Your sister doesn't judge people based on their appearance. Your brother-in-law is kind, so not a total loss. He nodded slowly, like he was filing this away. My mother was genuinely humiliated, he said. I've never seen her like that. It was, I don't know, probably good for her. I hope so, I said. I don't take pleasure in anyone's humiliation. But I do believe that sometimes people need to face the consequences of their assumptions. The months after the wedding were a process of redefining relationships with people I'd deliberately kept at a distance. Victoria and I did have that dinner. She cooked, which surprised me. She'd always struck me as someone who had people cook for her. The food was imperfect, and somehow that made it feel more genuine. We talked about our lives, our careers, our hopes for our children. It wasn't transformative. I don't think we'll ever be close. But there was a kind of respect that developed, a mutual acknowledgement that we were both just doing our best with the resources we had. Derek apologized eventually. It came at a golf outing that Marcus invited him to, apparently. My son told me about it afterward. Derek had admitted that he'd realized his own anxiety about his children's futures made him judgmental in ways that weren't helpful, that he was trying to be better. My son, bless him, had accepted the apology with grace. Chloe and I became closer. She would call me for career advice. She was working her way up in marketing and wanted to know how to navigate being a woman in corporate environments dominated by men. I became the person she came to when her mother was being insufferable, which was roughly monthly. It was the kind of relationship I hadn't expected to have with my daughter-in-law, but it felt right. Marcus knew eventually that I'd orchestrated the whole thing. He didn't ask me to confirm it, but he understood. One day, about a year after the wedding, he called me. I just wanted you to know, he said, that what you did wasn't just about me or about them. It was about something bigger. It made all of us look at the assumptions we were making about people, about you, about ourselves. I'm a better husband because of it, and I think Chloe's a better person now, too. I felt my heart squeeze. This was what I'd been hoping for all along. Not vindication, but transformation. Not proof that I was right, but evidence that the people I cared about were capable of growth. Thank you for telling me that, I said. I'm also incredibly proud of you, he added, for being brave enough to do that, for loving me enough to risk it. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and I thought about the woman in the Target sweater, standing at that dining room table surrounded by people who didn't see her. I thought about how hard it had been, in that moment, to remain silent, to accept their judgment and let it roll off me like water. But I also thought about how necessary it had been. Sometimes people need to see you in your authenticity before they can understand who you really are. I still wear discount clothes sometimes. I still drive the Subaru. I'm not performing humility, and I'm not hiding my success. I'm just living as myself, a woman who has worked hard for what she has, who is proud of her accomplishments, but who understands that those accomplishments don't define her worth. My worth comes from being present, being kind, being honest about who I am and what I believe. Victoria still drops names of restaurants and resorts, but now I understand that's just how she moves through the world. Derek still talks about his business deals, but I've learned that underneath the bragging is just a man who's insecure about his value. Preston is actually pretty funny once you get to know him, and he's working on being less insufferable. And Chloe, my Chloe, has become not just my son's wife, but my friend. The best part? The part I didn't expect? I no longer need any of them to validate my worth. That dinner, that awful, uncomfortable, infuriating dinner, taught me something I probably should have known already, but apparently needed to experience. You don't get to decide your value based on how other people perceive you. You get to decide it based on who you actually are. The rest is just people catching up to a truth you already know. That's the real story. Not about dressing down or testing people or the spectacle of a reveal. It's about learning to stand in your own truth and trusting that eventually people who matter will see you for who you really are. And if they don't, well, that says everything about them and nothing about you.